All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 1950s podcast. Here we go. We're going to get that screen ready, and we are going to begin the major transformations of the 1950s, an exciting time in history, an age of innocence, an age of rock and roll, of all kinds of exciting things. It's also kind of been discussed as, or described as this era of a great contrast between conservatism, a return to conservatism, and conformity, and yet at the same time, these forces of alienation and unrest. How do we see the two of these coming together? What happens in the 50s? We're going to talk social, cultural, economics, and a little bit of politics. So we already did the Cold War in another discussion, and civil rights will be in another lecture as well. That's why those aren't here. So, moving right along. Oh yeah, you heard it. The 1950s. The birth of rock and roll. That's right. Elvis Presley, of course, he didn't invent rock and roll. Let's not say that, but he was pretty crucial, first major rock star. In the era of sex, Marilyn Monroe, that sort of a sex figure and a whole shift. But at the same time, you see a little bit of the alienation. You see the famous picture of the Little Rock Nine. We'll get into that in the next lecture. Let's dive right into economics. We describe the 50s as the creation of America's permanent wartime economy. You see that, and we've seen throughout history that every time we go to war, of course, there's massive military spending. After the war, it plummets, as we can see in this graph that you're looking at up there, right? And then what happens when the Korean War comes along is it shoots up again, and this time it doesn't plummet, right? It just kind of goes steady and builds and builds and builds. We get to this point where if you look at the 1940s, 17.5% of spending is on military, 32% in the 50s. We reach an all-time high of 52% in the 1960s. Where are we today? It's estimated to be between 31 and 51%, depending on how you count things like veterans benefits and paying off the debt on a couple of our last wars that we mostly paid for by borrowing money. Good news about this system is it's helped to fuel these economic growth spurts, this idea of sustained growth with all of this government spending on the military going on, fueling high-tech industries and research and development have greatly benefited from this kind of influence or infusion into the government. Moving away from this, we can get to this next issue, the issue of agriculture shifting to agribusiness. A big change in America as we see that we go from the idea of one farmer making enough food for 15 people to only needing one farmer to make enough food for 50 people. Right? At the end of World War II, 15% of America was involved in agricultural industries. And by the 1990s, we're talking about only 2%. So it's really the beginning of the end of the idea of Americans as farmers. Although being down to 15%, we're already pretty close. Now, what are you looking at here in this map? You're looking at what we call the Sun Belt, right? America is on the move after World War II. 30 million people a year are moving within America, but it's a new kind of migration. It's not like the Great Migration of African Americans going south to north. Now we're talking about filling in the sort of warm, sunshiny parts of America. You can kind of see it as a big smiley face from Virginia all the way over to Florida, skipping a few parts of the South. Here's maybe a slightly more accurate portrayal of the main Sun Belt states. So Florida, Texas, California are the biggest. And when those are growing, who is shrinking? The Rust Belt, right? Detroit, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They're on the decline, right? The birth of the suburb. Dun, 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 dun. Here you see this beautiful sight, the true idea of conformity of the 50s where everything looks the same. Some of us consider it our own personal nightmare. Others think of this as the beautiful chance for Americans to own their own homes. The Federal Housing Administration giving more loans, also the development of highways, which we'll talk about shortly, leads to a situation where 1 out of 4 or 1 out of even 3 Americans owns their own home and lives in the suburbs. It's kind of an incredible scene. These are from the 70s and 80s, a lot of these pictures, but it starts in the 50s. As we're developing suburbs, our competitors over there in the Soviet bloc are developing block-style apartments that go on for miles and miles, this eyesore that is still pretty standard in every post-communist country that you'll visit. Some of these are Bulgaria, some of these are Slovakia. That was their urban view. Although if you look in the hillsides here in Sofia, you'll see that the suburban idea is also starting to take hold, everybody having their own freestanding home, right? Now, which Eastern European country is this one? Actually, they weren't the only ones doing this block-style housing. This is Minneapolis, Minnesota, built in the late 60s, early 70s, large-scale public housing for the minority groups, usually in the inner cities of some of our major cities. That's what this one was. But the suburb idea really comes out of this era, right? This is the original idea. $60 a month, you could have your own home back in the 50s. That was an incredible change in the way things were, right? It, of course, has its benefits and its negatives. The idea of the conformity of the 50s. This is a cartoon from the 1950s. Everybody in their same little suit. Everyone's supposed to be doing the same thing. When one guy changes it up, everybody gets upset. By 1960, 1/3 living in the suburbs. It all really starts with Levittown, right? The Levittown American dream. The Levitt brothers, William Levitt and his brother, producing hundreds of houses a week. You could make them faster. And of course, you needed lots of houses, not right away for this reason, but this will really help this boom in the 70s and 80s. It's the baby boom. Yes, that's right. It seemed like America was literally exploding. From 45 to 57, the war is over, economy is booming, and people are making babies. That's right, 140 million Americans in 1945. This number is going to skyrocket. When you look closely at this chart, it doesn't seem to be like enormously huge, but that little 5% average live births per thousand, going up from, say, 20 to 25 or even 15 to 25, it's absolutely incredible in how it will define a generation. These numbers will totally taper off by the 70s, and so we're going to see this huge group of Americans that are going to be growing and really changing America as we know it every time they get to a new age, right? One baby born every 7 seconds in 1957. This one here shows you the school enrollment. Notice how it's pretty stagnant. From 1910 to 1950, it stays about the same. The number of kids, this is just kindergarten through 8th grade, right? So if the baby boomers are born in the 50s, they're going to be going to kindergarten or 5th grade or 6th grade, somewhere between the 50s and the 60s. And look what happens. You go from 20 million to almost 30 million to almost 35 million kids in school. And so this really radically changes the face of elementary education. People have to think about it and talk about it. And then when these kids all become teenagers and they become young college-age students, that's the 60s, by the way, and that's when the youth rebellion comes to America. And then we have dynamics of the 80s when they all have jobs, right? And now the baby boom generation's all getting ready to retire or starting to retire, and it's profoundly impacting our country in ways that we don't even know what's going to happen yet. Right? So let's turn and talk about politics, the politics of the 50s. We remember that Truman was reelected in 48, and then here we get to 1952. Eisenhower, the I Like Ike campaign. Everybody loves the grandpa. He gets himself reelected in 56. His running mate was Richard Nixon with the old famous checkers speech. We're not quite ready for that yet, thank you. Richard Nixon was in some kind of a slush fund scandal, and he gave a very emotional speech about his dog, and he was forgiven for that. But yeah, let's talk about the politics of the 1950s, right? Domestic policy in the 1950s, liberalism versus conservatism. We're coming from FDR and then Truman, New Deal, and continuing the New Deal, right? But then we get Eisenhower's small government, Eisenhower-style republicanism, this really dynamic form of conservatism. We want to curb the TVA, we want to get rid of the New Deal and move into, or back into, the idea of small government, friendly to business government, lowering taxes. Some interesting, maybe slightly strange things. Eisenhower opposed the distribution of the anti-polio vaccine, the free distribution of it, I should say. You're looking here at Operation Wetback. This was the end of the Bracero program from World War II, bringing in Hispanics to work in the South. Now they were seen as more of a problem than a solution in the 50s. And so Operation Wetback 1954, sending more than 1 million Hispanics back across the border. Here's this process going on. And then we have, of course, one of the largest government programs, interestingly, that we have the Eisenhower, famous for small government and balancing the budget and cutting spending, but he also needs to be remembered as creating one of the most expensive government programs, but also perhaps one of the most important in American history, and it is the Interstate Highway Act, 1956. $27 billion will be spent. 40,000 plus miles of road will be built. And America will be finally connected in the way that it needed to be in order for our economy to really boom. And the economy really is going to skyrocket with this puppy, right? You're going to see the growth in trucking, the automobile industry, oil, travel, housing, suburbs. The only thing that seems to get hurt is the railroads because it's so much easier to get everywhere now. These are the interstates. Remember, you don't see famous roads like Highway Route 66 on here because those were what tended to be small little two-lane roads. These are the massive interstates, 25 here in Colorado. I grew up in Minnesota, 94 cut across us. I went to college out east. 95 goes from Maine all the way to Miami. Having these massive connections with these excellent, well-developed roads was really, really important, right? We have 1956. Of course, Eisenhower reelected, but let's talk about the Sputnik moment. There it is, right? That's the famous Soviet satellite, Sputnik, sent up into space, and it really woke us up in America. We were, as this headline here says, losing the space race. And we decided under Eisenhower and then really reinvigorated later by Kennedy to win the space race, so to speak. And so in 1958, NASA was created. And within a few years, the goal was to put a man on the moon, and we sure as heck did it before anybody else. Fear not if you're against large government spending. Notice what happens with NASA. NASA at its peak, when we're trying to put a man on the moon, gets up to 4.5% of our budget. Look where it has languished ever since then, especially since the 90s. Pretty close to this 0.5. That means like half a penny to every dollar of taxes is being spent on our space programs. There are many scientific types out there who are saying it's time to just double that. Let's get it to 1% so that we can do so much more. I also want to mention, don't have a slide here, the Indian New Deal. That was under FDR and a little bit of Truman, right? That was bringing back tribal rights. Eisenhower, and remember that had gone away from the Dawes Severalty of 87. Well, Eisenhower, unfortunately, under his policies, and Congress maybe more than Eisenhower, is going to bring us to what was known as the termination policy, to get the Indians off of the reservations. The idea was to shut down the reservations and to take away their reservation status and things like that. Unfortunately, what may have looked good on paper ends up being catastrophic, and you will hear stories of tribes like the Menominee of Wisconsin who lose half of what was guaranteed to them in their treaties, and in its place gain massive unemployment and poverty in a total failed program of trying to instantly modernize and assimilate them into modern American society. Let's turn to American culture of the 1950s, probably one of the most important things that comes out of the 50s. Started in the 20s, the idea of debt, right? And then in 1949, the first plastic credit card. The consumer era has been born, right? You can just show your little card rather than having any cash. Buy, buy, buy. Of course, within a few years, America is buried in a veritable landslide of credit cards, and credit debt reaches an all-time high right about 2007, 2008. And now we've actually kind of gone down a little bit, which is a good thing, probably. At the same time that credit cards are invented, it's also the time period of the birth of McDonald's and American fast food. This one's 1948. The first hamburgers were only 15 cents. Suddenly it's everywhere, and the idea is you can go anywhere and find the same great fast food. Yippee! A new generation of leisure and affluence. The birth of Disneyland, right? 1955. It was everyone's dream to be able to afford to go to vacation to a place like Disneyland. And that kind of, along with the suburbs and the highways and cultural attitudes, led to this idea of mass conformity, right? Here's a great picture from the 50s of everybody wearing their gray suits, the same gray suits. There was a sociological study, this is nonfiction, called The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman, which really, and several other editors, really pointed out some of these changes in the post-war generation. Another thing was with everybody moving, you didn't have family nearby, right? And so we see the birth of a whole new kind of self-help industry. One of the most famous is this fellow here, Dr. Spock, not the guy with the pointy ears. He's not a Vulcan. This guy wrote one of the most popular books of the 50s, the Book of Baby and Child Care. Why did nobody read books about how to raise babies before the 50s? It's not that they didn't, but they had other places to go. If you were a mom, you talked to your mom and your sisters and your aunts and your cousins because they were all in the same town that you've been in all your life, right? Well, now everybody's moving. You don't have family nearby, so you need to buy a book on how to raise your kids. Plus, there were so many babies, right? It's the baby boom that makes Dr. Spock the great, big successful figure. Other pop culture, we started the show with Elvis, rock and roll. Of course, he borrows his moves and his style from African-American music, but he really popularizes it with the white crowds, the mainstream crowds. Marilyn Monroe, Playboy magazine, whole new standards of sexuality coming out in the 1950s. On the negative side, we have this idea that science can conquer all, really strong in the 50s. And somebody looked at morning sickness. Well, women shouldn't have to be sick when they're having babies, even though they have been for all of human evolution that we're aware of. And so they created a pill, thalidomide, that was supposed to prevent morning sickness. And while it may have worked well, children were being born with these flipper-like limbs. 12,000 kids were born this way before the drug was banned, before we were a little bit safer on how we proposed drugs and things like that. Next slide, 1957, America's first passenger jet. Americans are taking to the aerospace, in great numbers. This was the 707, and it really does revolutionize the way and the affordability of being able to fly around the country and the world later. It's also the birth of the television set. Yes! This is, of course, an incredible moment. It starts in the 40s, but it was quite small. 7 million of them sold in 1951. TV shows like I Love Lucy. The amazing thing about the TV of the 50s is it really reflected the culture. The vast majority of shows were about male, patriarchal, suburban families. Donna Reed, Father Knows Best. The title tells you all right there, of course. Did everyone agree with this conformity and following what everybody else did, keeping up with the Joneses of the 1950s? No, there is a small counterculture revolution known as the Beat Generation. These guys are seen to sort of foreshadow the massive 60s rebellion of the youth, right? With the hippies and music and culture and art and freedom and all kinds of stuff. This is much smaller, but it really does set the stage in an incredible way, whether it's the music, the culture, the literature, all this stuff, right? These guys were rebelling against conformity and social standards of the day. Of course, famous for wearing your little beatnik beanie or beret and playing your bongo drums and your scat poetry and that kind of stuff. My personal favorite of the Beat Generation is Jack Kerouac. Here's a couple of great Kerouac quotes, some of them straight out of the Beatnik Dictionary. Kerouac wrote On the Road, which is a great story of just driving across and hitchhiking or riding across America and just kind of doing your own thing and not doing what you're supposed to. Even the way he wrote it was kind of revolutionary. He took a really long scroll of paper and ran it through his typewriter so he wouldn't have to take breaks, and he just typed and typed and typed, and he wrote this thing, and it's brilliant. It's incredible. He wrote all kinds of other books too, and there's other authors that we talk about from the 50s, like The Catcher in the Rye with his alienated, troubled teen hero. You've got a few other famous ones, Hemingway and Steinbeck. Those guys are more famous from the earlier generation, right? And we don't have the same kind of literary outpouring that we had after World War I. World War II was a much more righteous and just war is how it felt, right? Much more compared to World War I. And so we don't see as much of that stuff, but it's there nevertheless. It's an undercurrent, right? Also, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, this idea by Sloan Wilson, all about the search for meaning in a world dominated by conformity and big business and doing what you're supposed to do and all that stuff. It was turned into a movie the very next year. It was incredibly popular. So as this stuff was happening, people were really questioning it and they were challenging it. And that brings us to the question of women and women's roles. As I mentioned earlier, TV was all about the cult of domesticity. Leave It to Beaver, the woman's place in the kitchen, the mom, right? Didn't even share a bed with dad. Not even maybe a room sometimes. Ozzie and Harriet show. These were the popular shows, but we're going to see the seeds planted at the end of the 50s and at the beginning of the 60s. 1963 is when The Feminine Mystique comes out, the year's most controversial bestseller, the book that talks about women's role outside the home, pursuing success in society and business and politics and whatever they find to be the most rewarding. And this is a huge hit, and it's really the beginning of a major movement for change, freedom, and equality. And that's going to be something we're going to see starting in our very next lectures. Thanks for coming, and we'll talk to you later.